guys, I'm finally doing another shipping analysis video. Whee! I should really probably try and get in the habit of doing stuff like this regularly. For today, I was actually wanting to talk about a particular genre of shipping, so to speak, and I'll probably make a couple other videos as well talking about about different types of ships. Today, I wanted to talk about a variety of ship that I like to call the rival ship. The inspiration for talking about this was I recently started doing my first ever crossover story, which is primarily crossing over Invader Zim with Steven Universe. I'll talk about crossover ships in another video, though. But as I was doing some of the artwork for the first couple of pages of my comic Percy, I was looking around at reference art for Invader Zim because I haven't drawn the characters in a while, and I was just trying to get a good feel for the style again and get back into the groove. And you run into all this Zim and Dib shipping, of course, and this is one of those pairings that falls under what I call the rival ship. Now, when I say rival shipping, it can refer to characters who are rivals, but I also use it to refer to characters that are arch enemies but are shipped together. Essentially, any two characters that are regularly at odds or on opposing teams with each other for whatever the reason falls under what I refer to as the rivalship. And as far as rivalships go, Zim and Dib has actually been one of the ones that I probably like the best. My reasoning for it really just has a lot to do with the fact that these are two characters that kind of a lot of their sense of purpose and self-worth comes from the competition that exists between them. If you get rid of Zim, then Dib doesn't really have anything to strive for, and if you get rid of Dib, then the whole conquering the Earth thing just isn't very fun for Zim. And if you've read some of the scripts for some of the episodes that were never finished for Invader Zim, there was one episode that actually covered this specific idea in which Dib gives up on trying to beat Zim and pursues real science, and both characters end up miserable without that competition between them. Because in reality, they're probably actually kind of like close friends in a weird sort of way, because they both derive enjoyment and a sense of purpose out of the relationship that they have, getting back at each other constantly. This is this constant back and forth that they have. Um, but it comes into to question the whole rival shipping thing in general and why it is so popular, and it exists in pretty much every fandom I can think of. Well, one of them has to do with just fangirls love their smutty crack yaoi ships. Alright? Don't deny it, ladies. We all know that we do it to some extent. Alright? And it's not really a big deal. I mean, I hear people complain about the over-sexualization of women in media. Honestly, I don't care about women being sexualized in media, because you know what? Men are equally sexualized, just in different ways. And yaoi ships are one good example of the over-sexualization of men, oftentimes. But aside from it just being sexy yaoi couples, I think there's another thing that comes into play to the popularity of rival ships. Now, I get that a rival ship could be between two girls. I mean, there's no reason why it couldn't be. You could have two female characters that are constantly at odds but get shipped together. But I see fewer of them, that it doesn't happen with two chicks. It just seems to be something that happens more often as a yaoi ship thing. Zim and Dib, Sonic and Shadow, Bill and Dipper. I could probably list 20 billion others just off the top of my head, but I'm not going to go into all of them. Anyway, you get my point. So, what's the plausibility of rival shipping? Surely there are people who are saying, rival ships are just, purely just to be fun and you know, to exploit the characters and whatnot, and there's absolutely no merit, validity, or weight to any of them. To this, I'm actually gonna disagree a little bit here. For starters, I think it depends slightly on the characters in particular. Actually, I think it depends quite a lot on the characters. For starters, there is still a difference between rivals and arch enemies. Zim and Dib should be arch enemies, but honestly, they feel like the primary defining difference between the two is that arch enemies are two characters that are working on completely opposing sides and want completely opposite things. The one guy wants to destroy the world and the other guy wants to save it. Rivals are two characters that are actually working towards the same goal usually, but are competing with one another. Like, say, in Pokemon, for example. So, part of whether or not a rivalship works actually kind of boils down to whether or not these characters are actually arch enemies or just rivals. If they're rivals, then there's actually a bit more plausibility to it because the characters aren't inherently working towards completely opposing goals. In fact, there are a lot of rivals in fiction that are actually very close friends, even though they're constantly competing with each other. So, when it comes to characters that are rivals and not arch enemies, I would say there's actually a decent level of plausibility. Of course, anytime you take two characters that are heterosexual and turn them gay just for the sake of a story, you're automatically going against something that is a main feature of the character design. Personally, I'm not too bothered by it. I mean, if you want to turn a straight character gay for the sake of your story, that's fine, as long as the rest of the character remains true to who they are. You can take two straight characters, turn them gay, and not really change anything significant about their personality or the way they interact with the world. And so, as long as you remain true to that aspect, then I don't really mind the change in sexuality too terribly much. But it is technically out of character. When it comes to arch enemies, is where the plausibility gets really muddled here. For starters, if you're turning a straight character gay for the sake of the ship, you're automatically sort of pushing on that sort of suspension of disbelief, like you're automatically doing something that is potentially out of character, and the audience is just going to have to try and accept that this is a thing, you know? You're asking them to accept quite a lot when you take a straight character and you turn them gay. But then to take that straight character, turn them gay, and then pair them up with somebody they hate, you're asking a lot of your readers in these kinds of stories. Like, a lot. I'm not saying it's impossible, and it could maybe work, but these stories are difficult to pull off well, and most of the time when you see them done, they just come across as these cliche little romance stories that they might be fun for what they are. They may have some sexy imagery or whatever, but they pretty much don't have a lot of substance more often than not. The funny thing about this, though, is that when in the case of rival ships, you actually have the potential to do something very complicated and intricate with the characters. But this really relies on the writer's ability to stay true to those characters. You can potentially present the audience with a story that is emotionally compelling and complex, as these characters develop some kind of deeper emotions for each other despite being on conflicting sides. And it could completely be something really interesting, but again, in order for you to really do that kind of story well, you need to know how to write within the realm of the characters, how to write them realistically. And I'll go back to the Zim and Dib thing just as my example here. Zim and Dib technically qualify as arch enemies because they are on opposing sides working for opposing things. Zim wants to take over the world and Dib is trying to stop him. Pretty basic hero-villain relationship here going on. But as I said before, we kind of get the vibe that Zim and Dib, although they are working against each other, kind of depend on each other to lead fulfilling lives. If either one of them were to lose the other, they lose a lot of what makes their life enjoyable, you know? So, in a weird way, they're kind of like best friends and arch enemies at the same time. So, as far as different rival ships and their plausibility, this is one of those rival ships that I'm actually a little bit more apt to believe, just because of how dependent these two characters are on each other. I guess that pretty well describes just rival ships in general. In pretty much any fandom, the rival ship is usually the one that is the most difficult to do well. It's easy to create some piece of fan art or story with rival shipping that is just some cheap little romance thing, Romeo, Juliet, whatever, but it's difficult to do rival ships and to do them well. They can be done well. Um, when it comes to rival shipping, I will say to those who are writing fan fiction and things like that, I would save rival ships for a little bit later on when you've had a bit more practice with stuff that's maybe a little bit easier to do. You can do a really cool story with rival shipping. It's just challenging and maybe not somewhere to start as a beginner. that's pretty much the thoughts on this subject. Speaking of fan fictions and fan content or whatever, if you're interested in seeing my little Invader Zim crossover project I'm working on, which I call Percy, I'll put a link in the description down below, as well as to my new Tapastic account where I will be posting most of my webcomics, both original projects and fanfic projects. It's a cool website. You can go on there, make an account and subscribe to all sorts of webcomics and stuff. It's also like an app for your phone too, so you can read webcomics when you're out and about in a dentist office or on the bus or whatever. Um, so yeah, that's all I got to say for now. And remember, don't take yourselves too seriously.